Edward Timke is a doctoral student in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Michigan, where he researches the role of media in shaping Franco-American identities and relations. Before Michigan, Edward served as a manager of exchanges between American, French, and Swiss universities at ISEP, International Student Exchange Programs in Washington, D.C. You should be the timekeeper, not me. He also taught English in a French high school at Saint-Étienne, France. Edward is a recipient of Michigan's Rackham Merit Fellowship and holds a master's in intercultural communication from the University of Denver, as well as a bachelor's in international relations and French from Michigan State University. Edward Timke est fasciné par un pays imaginaire appelé les États-Unis, qu'on retrouve dans les pages de la revue française Paris Match. Sa présentation nous invite à considérer cette construction médiatique durant une période d'effervescence pour toute chose américaine, un phénomène stimulé après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale par The Marshall Plan, ainsi que d'autres plans, moins bien compris et connus, qui contribuaient à la guerre froide. Nous regarderons les 6 premières années d'existence de Paris Match, 1949 à 1955, attentive à sa complexité temporelle, sa représentation sélective de la mémoire collective, l'optimisme de sa narration du quotidien et ses visions futuristes de progrès et prospérité. Un pays, les États-Unis, imaginé par un autre. Edward.
Avant de commencer en anglais, je voudrais m'excuser de m'imposer la langue anglaise, mais si on voudrait me poser des questions en français, c'est bon. Et je vais essayer de répondre en français aussi. Mais c'est plus efficace pour moi de parler en anglais, mais je vous remercie de supporter mon anglais. Thank you. First, I would like to thank Marcia for the kind introduction. Also, Vincent, Mirna, and the technical crew for helping me get I have a kind of a weird format for my presentation, so I thank you for that. And it's my first time in Montreal, and I'm very happy to be in Quebec and the hospitality here, so it's been great. The first thing I'd like to do is give you 4 warnings. I guess it's my 4 footnotes before. I'm not an art historian, but I am an international relations media history scholar. And so my narrative will be a bit different. My training, I'm kind of schizophrenic where we do humanities and social sciences. So my intention is not to come off as too scientific, but maybe that's my second warning, is that I'm a little Cartesian in my division of presenting. Also, I'm at the beginning of my research project, so I may be making bold claims. I would like you to challenge them and if you have any suggestions to help me. So I'm making some large claims, and I hope to add more research and substantiate that. And also, when I use the word American, I don't mean to the Canadians and Mexicans are included in that, but in this time period, Paris Match referred to the United States as America and American. So that's just kind of going back to the way it was referenced then. So actually, let me go back. I would like to go into our grandmother's attic for today, and I'm going to bring you through, I've looked at the first 6 years of Paris Match, having my eyes fall out looking at in the archives, but it was a wonderful adventure. And the reason why I kind of went into this is I grew up in a very small town, in a rural agricultural town in Wisconsin, and my only way of viewing the world was through photojournals, television, and so that really informed my way of seeing the world, and so that kind of fed into my career, where I worked in international education, and now into my research. What is the role of media in shaping the way people can see the world when they might not have access to it? So let me give you a little historic context of kind of the birth of Paris Match. Paris Match, is still around today, but it was born in the 30s, actually. Match was originally started in the 1920s as a sports magazine, and it was bought by Jean Prouvost, who has an interesting history as a media mogul, but he also he owned wool factories and the famous brand Penguin. He was the one who was behind that. So he bought Match in 1938 and kind of changed the way it looked. He had this experience with Paris Soir where he experimented with photography, and so he tried to make this mark in a photojournal, which was influenced greatly by his reading of Life magazine. And so with the Second World War, that got shut down, and that kind of led to some more political problems after the war in him trying to restart the magazine. So not to oversimplify the kind of disjuncture of the war, I'm going to jump from Match and go to after the war. The cultural milieu in the post-war France was, France was reconstructing, and there was all kinds of tensions in terms of reconciling who was a collaborationist, who wasn't, and then just how was the country, how would it be rebuilt? And the United States had a very large role in that process. Through what is commonly referred to as the Marshall Plan. The technical name was the European Recovery Program. And so over a period of from 1948 to 1953, the US government put roughly $2.3 billion into reconstructing France. So the American government came and they had little caravans that were traveling around France, showing what American life was like. They also gave money for machines, and there was a lot of movement between the US and France in terms of artists and government workers. So there was this tension of kind of a thank you for helping, but there's also this, this anxiety of kind of imposition. So there was a love-hate with the United States. And there was a great quote by Erwin Wall that really summarizes the attitudes between the US and France after the Second World War. And antinomies in the two cultures became exaggerated through confrontation. French Cartesianism versus American pragmatism. Statism versus private initiative. Centralization versus decentralization. A revolutionary myth versus a carefully cultivated myth of national consensus. The United States became the standard of modernization for most nations in the post-war era. The French blamed their traditions for their nation's relative backwardness and were invited to internalize an American image of themselves as feudal, archaic, politically unstable, economically stagnant, and a stalemate society. But there's a lot of loaded language in there. But basically, there is this tension between maybe a more dominating United States that was more centralized, more decentralized, and trying to corporatize things. And so there was this tension within kind of the thankfulness for the assistance. And on the French side, this is also kind of continuing with the quote, for the French, America was excessively mechanized, devoted to efficiency and rationalization, to neglect of humane values, in short, materialist, capitalist, and imperialist. Americans were drab, conventional, and devoid of individualism. The United States was an uncultured society of overgrown children imbued with naive optimism. And while pragmatic, Americans were blinded by their superiority and did not have a theoretical understanding coming from the wisdom of experience in the old world. So that's a very dramatic statement of that tension, and part of me wonders whether that really played out within the images of Paris Match. Just another note, Paris Match was a welcome style. It borrowed from, I really enjoyed Audrey Leblanc's presentation yesterday, kind of looking at the way in which kind of borrowing and going back and forth. And that really was the case for the birth of Paris Match, where he was taking an American model, but then making it in a French context. But that's what's very interesting. And it was also combining the different colors, the different images, and the text, very much in a lifelike form. And so it was very popular and resonated with people, especially as the government was regulating and limiting what could be started. And the reason why Paris Match started in March 1949 is because Jean Prouvost, during the war, published his newspaper, Paris Soir, from a distance, and there was a law after the Second World War where they didn't allow people who were publishing during the war to publish again. And he was also very wealthy, and so they were worried about propaganda. So that's the historic contents. So the research problem. Because I come from an international relations background, there's a lot of focus on the anxieties between Americanization and France. And oftentimes the media, and including Paris Match, is seen as one little piece of the puzzle, and then they focus on economic, political issues. And so in reading that literature, I think there needs to be more at stake in media, since it's my job in media. But I also think they're not looking at the discursive functioning of the media in playing out those relations. There is a wealth of literature on the history and birth of Paris Match. There was a most recently published by Bacot and a team about kind of how Paris Match was an American model, but refined in a European way, through Life magazine. And because Paris Match is still published today, although it has this trajectory where it's changed, it really has an important place in everyday French culture. Whether or not it's considered high or low culture today, it's still held a very important place. And my proposition is that Paris Match played a significant role in imagining the United States, which in turn, by looking at the United States, kind of helped the French look back at themselves. And I'm not trying to simplify that, saying that all French people saw this in the same way. And that's where at the end I'll say that one area for research is to actually look at the reception and the different readings of it. But I'm really influenced by the chapter that Peter Hamilton wrote in Stuart Hall's textbook about kind of reconstituting Frenchness through humanist photography after the Second World War. So I'm kind of inspired by that to go into to see how this functioned. And here you see an ad that's interesting for Air France. It's a Native American who is looking presumably over Niagara Falls. So everything that I've included is a reference to the United States, kind of images that were peppering the magazines. So my questions are, how was the United States represented in the immediate post-Second World War era? What images and texts were used to represent and map the United States? And then what do these images and texts tell us about US-French relations, the rebuilding and reworking of French national identity, and more generally, how does media and photojournalism play a role in forming national identity? So why does this matter? I mentioned earlier, Paris Match is around today, but it was an explicit new media intervention. And I'm putting new media not in the sense as we know of Facebook today, but in the sense that it was very refreshing in the post-war era. But it really built on a large body of literature about the mappings and kind of bringing together of people for a national identity. So this goes to Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, although I'm not looking at the genesis of French nationalism, but the way in which a magazine can kind of bring people together in an imagined space. Walter Lippmann was an American journalist and critic, and he wrote in 1922 Public Opinion, which talked about the ways in which media shape the maps that are put in our head. So kind of going back to what I said, growing up, relying on magazines. Through the filter of media, some people do not have contact with, in the case of post-war France, United States. So the media really kind of play a role in shaping the maps, the schemata, kind of very psychological, the way in which one views a culture and maps it cognitively. Also, Edward Said's the Orientalism, the way in which one can view another in order to constitute oneself, is very useful in kind of looking at another culture and then bringing it back. But what's complicated there is there's kind of an issue of race. And so that's why Maria Todorova, she wrote a very interesting piece about what is called Balkanism, the idea of looking at the Baltics in Western Europe, looking at the Baltics as kind of the European other that was white, had a relative, it was a different religion, but it was still within the kind of, the Western Christian model. And so the way in which newspapers, travel journals kind of constructed Western European identity by viewing the Balkans and kind of distancing, but then kind of getting close at the same time. So I think that's a very useful way to look at the way in which there's this tension of love and hate between the US and France. So what is the way in which there's a getting close and distancing? Also important is the issue of social memory, collective memory, the ways in which images kind of pull from the past to deal with the present. And then a recent book by Ponti looks at the way in which that plays out to imagine the future. That's often, we oftentimes think of the past affecting the present, but what are the anticipations in a historic moment for the future? So that's kind of a new way of going into collective and social memory. So this is where maybe I'm a little more social science-y, but I'm going to show you the man behind the curtain. How did I get to some of the images that I showed you? I took a very inductive, grounded archival approach, which basically means, although I just showed you the research questions, I basically started paging through Paris Match, and I saw, wait a second, there's a lot of images of the United States. What is happening here? And unless someone knows, I'll buy you coffee or a beer or something. If you know of an index of the early years of Paris Match, I would love to see that, but it was on the state side, I couldn't find it. So I literally had to page through every single page of Paris Match from 1949 to 1955. The reasons for which I chose these dates, well, one, the magazine was born in March 1949, and then 1955 in May is kind of when the colonial question really starts to erupt. Ideally, I would have liked to have gone to 1958 with Charles de Gaulle's famous speech, kind of a new republic, a new way of nationalism. But for time reasons, that's where I stopped. So because I couldn't take photocopies, I took photographs, which I got a lot of strange looks in the library as I'm snapping photos. And I made my own archive. And the way in which I went through that, this goes back to my Cartesianness, is to really, because again, there was no index, I created an index where I constantly kept comparing images to each other to see if they had similarities or differences and to try to group them into themes. So that's where that grounded, inductive approach came from. So what were the themes that came? So there are 6 main themes. One that I'm going to talk about today is the independent, miserable American woman. There are schools of life and wealth, so looking at the ways in which the American education system worked. There's a fascinating look. It's not really touristic, but they look at the different cities in the United States and really focus on they called it the panther of the United States, where there are different patches, and how the economic and racial inequalities kind of really made it a unique situation. But ironically, in that moment, there was no reference back to the colonial system or the issues going on in France. And then some kind of more, not necessarily everyday life, but looking at what relates to the keynote speakers, the inventions of the atomic bomb, and different discoveries. There was one where they had like this snore machine where somebody had to put in this mouth guard, and there was kind of this obsession over American inventions. But at the same time kind of questioning where is its place in French life. Of course, there's the issue of Hollywood, where French actors wanted to become part of Hollywood, but at the same time, there were also actors rejecting. And then this kind of hero-villain superpower in the Cold War moment. So again, I'm going just, for sake of time, and to get kind of the rich details, is to look at the independent, miserable American woman. So one of the earliest representations of the American woman was this 5-page feature of Phyllis Nelson in September of 1949. The headline reads, "Is Phyllis Nelson is an American woman like all the others?" And which is very interesting. It goes back to Walter Lippmann's idea of kind of the reification of culture. The media kind of filter the way in which one is seen. And so this is the femme américaine typique. And how they explained it, the reason why they looked for her and why they described her, was very interesting. So this was the vexing question for the French. For some, the young American woman is a brilliant and adulated creature. For others, she's disenchanted, vain, superficial, and cold. What is the truth? So at this time, Paris Match had its own team based in New York City. The main person was Raymond Cartier, who was their #1 guy, who they always featured him on covers. And so this New York-based team really tried to find the typical American woman. And so they selected her because she was atypical. And so what was their explanation for this? They said, in her habits and mentality, Phyllis Nelson is identical to the millions of other young women who filled the offices and shops, not only in New York City, but in all the United States. This is not Miss America, as in the beauty pageants. It's Miss America, as in life. So they see this atypical American woman, like Phyllis Nelson, who aspires to move to the big city. She's most likely from a rural part of the middle part of the US in the Midwest, from a town. And she most likely wants to go work in the clerical field. So if any of you have seen the show Mad Men, it's almost, you're seeing Mad Men happen through this. But what's really fascinating is that this article really fits the post-war French occupation with the everyday. So Henri Lefebvre, who looked at kind of everydayness, the importance of the everyday, it's really fascinating because they look at everything she does. They follow her closet, they follow her ironing, they focus on how much she makes per month, and they look at her apartment. And in the language that's used, it's constantly implied we're referring back to the French case. So, she gets up at, 6 a.m. to iron her dress. And so it's kind of, what are French women doing at the same time? So it's not necessarily explicit, but it's implied in the language. And it continues, following her eat her lunch, eating ice cream, talking with her advisor at work, what perfume she wears, painting her fingernails. So it's very fascinating. It's going into the everyday life, and it's simplifying the American woman to this one case. And it gets better. But there's kind of a positive side too. Kind of this relates to the theme that I said about the schools. There was an in-depth cover that said the University of California system is like all American universities. And they do a special feature of women within that. And the opening cover that I created was actually 3 women who were part of a sorority, which is kind of a club of women. I don't know if this exists in Canada. The sorority is it's a system where, so it's like a clique. And so it's very interesting. So they follow the classes they take. They're pom-pom girls. It's the great time that they have. They get to learn how to swim, and they all come together while they're vacuuming and studying, which is very interesting because, the placing of the woman in, with the vacuum. And also, what do they do in classes? They're making dresses. Their inspiration are the French cases. And ironically, you look at the top, what are the men doing? They're watching American football and going to sporting events. But the American woman, life is not all a bed of roses. What happened is, this going back to Phyllis Nelson, is there's this anxiety about getting married. In order to be a successful American woman, you have to have a boyfriend. And she's very lucky because she has 6 or 7 of them at the same time. And so there's this anxiety that's shown. So how does this play out on the French side? Why are they focusing on this anxiety? A a little bit after the Phyllis Nelson feature, there is this matière à réflexion, so something that you must reflect upon. And there's a whole article about, and again, this is also the time that Simone de Beauvoir's Deuxième Sexe is coming out, so there's this debate about, what is the role of women? And there's a special section about the chains of the American man, and it's a warning to the Frenchmen that this is going to come to them. But the American woman is bossy. She, after the man comes home from work, she doesn't have to lift a finger, according to the article. So there's kind of this sexism built in as well. And there's a really fascinating debate in the summer of July 1951. Again, this is Raymond Cartier wrote the first article in May, and he said, the American woman, is she the unhappiest in the world? So he lists all these things that women are constantly competing for a man, and that, that this would come to France eventually, and women are tied to their machines in the United States. And so an American woman in Paris was really angry about this. She said, what are you talking about? So Margaret Gardner, an American in Paris, she said, French women are just as miserable as the American woman. And his reference to the wife having her grapefruit fetched for her is kind of nonsense, because he's only really looking at the American Westerns and seeing the macho American man and not really understanding what's really happening. So the conclusion of that was kind of a response of different French women responding, and their conclusion was a French woman is the happiest. And the reasons are, and I'll say them in French because I think it's more poignant, is elle fait faire sauter des crêpes, son maquillage ne fait pas mentir son physique, pas de mari bon à tout faire. And then one fascinating longer quote, which I didn't want to butcher the French, so I translated into English, was by a woman from Grenoble, and she wrote, Madame Isabelle Blanchard of Grenoble wishes to American women to never know the years that French women lived during the occupation. So this goes back to the idea of memory. They're remembering this. And this is what she said. Because if in America it's the husbands who do everything, aided by their electric machines, I wonder, she said, what American women would do with half an hour of electricity each day in good times and their husband absent. They probably would blow their brains out. And this is interesting, because at this time, as I showed some of the ads, what's working within Paris Match is you have images of all the machines that they're criticizing. Some of the makeup is actually called pancake makeup, Hollywood Max Factor. So you have this kind of ambivalent moment where they're looking at the United States to deal with tensions of what is going to be the French woman and the man's place in relation to the French woman into the future. So very briefly, I do want to say again, these are tentative conclusions, but I'd like to continue with my analysis, go to 1958, and I only looked at the textual and visual side. So I want to see how is this produced, particularly Raymond Cartier's look, in shaping this. He started this debate over the American woman in 1951, and also see how that influenced the representations. And then probably one of the more impossible tasks would be assessing the audience reception. And what was that influence? Because, again, we see kind of a creation of a white middle-class American woman, and it's probably, there's an intended audience, but there are many different types of people reading the magazine. So I wanted to thank you very much, and welcome any questions or suggestions. Thank you.